evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and I'm here with a guest, Lisa Maccario. Did I pronounce it right?
You did.
Okay. We had an Italian from the city on the show, and he gave me a lesson in English pronunciations versus Italian pronunciations. So,
Right.
so we
You did a good job.
Okay. So basically, you're in the business of jail diversion.
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? What is it about?
So the jail diversion program, it's actually sort of a misnomer the way it's named. It is technically jail diversion. What we do is we go out into the community and we try to intervene while a crisis is happening for someone who is struggling with a behavioral health, a mental health, an acute stress disorder, and diverting whatever is happening from the criminal justice system to a more appropriate level of care. But it's really not just jail diversion. We're trying to, even people who don't have any sort of behavior that could be construed as criminal or even a misdemeanor, we're out doing interventions. So it's more of a behavioral health liaison for the police department with social services.
Well, if these are not criminal investigations all the time,
Right.
How do you get involved, or how does the police department get involved in some of these events?
You know, police officers are seen as being a catch-all for everything out in the community. From a medical issue to a criminal issue to mental health. In fact, you know, a small amount of their responses in the community are criminally connected. I'd say maybe 30% of their calls. Most of their calls are about serving the public. And so in that vein, you receive calls for people who are, you know, having anxiety attacks, depression disorders, you know, everything under the sun, psychiatric, psychotic, homelessness, substance use, family disorders, family, you know, discord, everything. So I get activated from a police report from the police. So I co-respond with the community impact unit out in the community. I also follow up on police reports that I receive through the police department with phone calls and then visits if needed. I connect people to services through those interventions.
Well, one of the things I follow in the paper regularly is the police blotter. And yeah, there's a lot of events recorded that somebody was yelling in the street or somebody was banging on somebody's door,
Right.
kind of thing. So I guess these are the kinds of things you're talking about that
Mm-hmm.
are over and above actual criminal events.
Right.
So I guess the question is, when you say you intervene or you go with the community impact unit, that's
Mm-hmm.
Sergeant Costa, I assume.
Sergeant Costa and Officer Justin Shears.
Okay, I forgot about Justin Shears, yeah. So when they go out on a call, are you already with them, or they meet you there, or do they call you on
Sometimes
site?
it varies. It depends on, you know, where we are at the time and what we're doing. I cover 6 police departments, not just Beverly.
Yeah.
I am centered in Beverly. The grant that we received through the Department of Mental Health covers Beverly, Essex, Gloucester, Ipswich, Manchester, and Rockport. And I'm technically here 3 days a week, Monday, Thursday, Friday. And those are the days we try to address concerns out in the community as a collective unit. But most of the calls are done by our law enforcement officers who are on patrol. So a call comes in to dispatch and they're dispatched to a situation. So our officers in Beverly are very well trained and do a great job of identifying and managing a psychiatric issue and getting people diverted from the criminal justice system. Then they take them to the emergency room. part of my role is to follow up on those calls that have been transported to the emergency room to see what the disposition was after that assessment was done there. And sometimes I can intervene even when they're there and get them connected to services. So it depends on when the call comes in and where I am and what's going on.
So one of the things that they changed in the system is that if somebody is having a problem and somebody, and this is where I get a little fuzzy, somebody decides they could be a hazard to themselves or to the community or somebody else, they can be held for, what is that, I think 72 hours. And what does that really come down to? Where are they held? And
so one of the things to understand about this civil commitment, Section 12, Mass State Law, Section 12, what it really, when a police officer is in the community and they cannot de-escalate a situation enough to have somebody voluntarily enter the ambulance to go for assessment to the emergency room, they have the ability to issue the Section 12. It's a pink slip. Essentially what that does is it assists the law enforcement officers to detain the person enough to keep them in the ambulance to get them to the emergency room. Once they're at the emergency room, it's up to the doctor in charge in the emergency room to decide what happens with that civil commitment. So they're brought in and they're assessed at the emergency room there. And whether they hold a Section 12 or they release a Section 12 is up to a psychiatric team and the medical team.
okay, if they release them, obviously the individual goes back home or back to where he came from.
Well, no, a lot of times they're released to what's called a community stabilization unit, a CCS. There's one in Salem, Leahy has one in Salem, and there's one in Lowell. And those are voluntary placements where people can go for 3 to 5 days to get their medication adjusted, get support services to help them. Mental health, chronic, true mental health disorders can be chronic, and people often need sort of a respite or a place to get some extra TLC, whether it is therapy, group work, and medication adjustments. So they can do that on a voluntary basis at a CCS, or if they are so psychiatrically, impaired where their ability to care for themselves is at question, or they're suicidal or homicidal, they go to an inpatient hospital where they'll stay until they are stabilized.
So
And the Section 12 that's issued from the hospital at that point. So somebody will be transported from the emergency room to an inpatient psychiatric hospital. That Section 12 is good for 72 hours. That was where you got the 72-hour time frame.
Okay.
When they get into that psychiatric facility, it is then incumbent upon that psychiatric team to decide whether to hold a Section 12 longer, and they sometimes have to go for a court hearing for that, or the person will voluntarily sign on to stay until they are stable.
So this court hearing, is that what they mean by having a dangerous assessment or something like that? Or is that something?
A danger to self or others, yeah. But that would be more of a criminal thing. The dangerousness hearing is more if somebody has been charged with a crime, and the court will decide whether somebody is truly a danger and they should be held. That's more if they're held in Middleton or something.
So that's more of a decision about setting bail and releasing him on bail,
Right.
or holding him in jail for a criminal offense.
Right.
So where is this nearest psychiatric hospital if somebody needs to go there?
Well, Leahy has a psychiatric hospital called Bay Ridge in Lynn, but there we do what we call a bed search. So when we're looking for an inpatient level of care unit that has an opening, we call the whole list. So there's many. There's Terra Vista out in Devons. There's High Point down in Plymouth. I could name them all. There's Bay Ridge in Lynn. There's Anna Jakes in Amesbury. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
There's McLean's out in Belmont. The Salem Hospital has an inpatient unit.
Yeah, the one I keep thinking of is Bridgewater because it dates back to the Titicut Follies fiasco, but that's a long story.
So Bridgewater State Hospital is a criminal situation. So so Bridgewater is where people go when they have criminal charges, yet they also have psychiatric issues, mental health issues that need to be addressed. They will go to a Bridgewater.
Oh, okay.
There is no crime in having a mental health illness. And so what is incumbent upon us, and this is a huge responsibility for police officers. I don't think people realize what a challenge it is for them. You know, when do we divert somebody from the criminal justice system? When is the crime small enough that you can divert them and get them stable and they're not going to be a burden on society and through criminality? And so that they will oftentimes, when they see somebody that's having a mood disorder or psychotic issues, they will have them assessed at the emergency room. So they don't even get involved in a Bridgewater. They don't get involved in the courts at all. The court that I was talking about in the hospital, when they have to get somebody held once they're inpatient level of care for psychiatric reasons, is a mental health court. It's very different than a criminal court.
Okay. So the scenario comes down to one of some sort of complaint goes into 911. The police show up. The regular patrol officers show up, and they try to stabilize the situation. If it's something that they are not comfortable with, they call in Sergeant Coster or somebody from the community impact. They notify you, and that's how the whole scenario gets going. How long does this normally take? Is this something that happens in hours? Is it a day long or a couple of days?
So, like I said, it has many facets to it. We've been called out into the community where I can do an assessment right in the field, not even take them by ambulance to a hospital, do an assessment and get them, diverted and sent to maybe a CCS or sent to a detox, or stabilize the situation and connect them with their already in place outpatient providers, or get them connected to outpatient providers. So that may happen. We may end up maybe out in the field, and I'm working with somebody who's, really distraught and struggling, and my intervention will help calm them. And I will accompany them for comfort to the emergency room and walk them through the situation so that they're not so victimized, as it was not really the right word, but so that they're not traumatized more than they already feel, But the majority of these calls, to be honest with you, if there was a social worker on every shift with the police department, they would be responding to all these calls. It would look very different. So now, because I only work 3 days a week in Beverly, and most of the work I do is follow-up, the police officers are out there doing that job. And they have been trained in something that the state runs called crisis intervention training. It's a 40-hour training. They learn about basically mental health first aid. They're taught, given a general overview of mental health disorders and how they present, and what are some of the most effective and most humane de-escalation techniques. They are informed about resources and how to connect somebody to an appropriate resource. The Beth Israel Leahy Behavioral Health Psychiatric Crisis Team, which is a 24/7 team. It's run out of Salem, but they are crisis clinicians, which is who I technically work for, even though I'm contracted with the police department. I was, in fact, one of those crisis clinicians. And so there is that unit as well that people can go to instead of going to an emergency room. So some of the police officers can divert them to that location instead of the hospital, if they're with a family member or they're capable enough to get themselves there. Some police officers, especially in Beverly, not my other communities because it's a little more difficult for those officers to do, but some officers here have actually driven them to that location instead of taking them to the hospital because they're stable enough to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It can look very different on any given day. What the citizens of Beverly should know is that there is a sensitivity and a comprehensive program that is available to them for whatever they need. We can meet their need, whether it's with a police officer or whether it's through the follow-up that I do. We help connect them, and they're treated respectfully and humanely, so that they're not re-traumatized after already struggling with some behavioral and mental health issue.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the reason I'm sensitive to timing is we had a discussion on the show a while back with Cindy Baez talking about domestic violence events. And in those cases, there's like a 6-hour window that they can hold the perpetrator and for something. And that's kind of a short time period to resolve some of these problems that have generated for some time. And I would assume the same thing is true, that somebody who has mental health issues didn't just snap overnight and it's a plunk your magic twanger and all of a sudden they're better again kind of thing. So these things take a while. And the other thing you mentioned that I'd like to explore a little bit is the comment you made about if we had a social worker on every shift. There's a lot of noise going on about defunding the police and putting more money into social work. Where do you come down on this? What's your take on it?
You know, I know that there's been a lot of dialogue about that. You know, it's the current narrative, but I honestly feel as though in that narrative, they need to talk to people that actually are out doing this work. I would not feel comfortable responding to a call in the community without law enforcement. You just never know how somebody is going to respond or how somebody is going to react. That being said, when somebody calls, say, the crisis team, we talked about the crisis team in Salem, the call center will ask appropriate questions to identify safety, like, are there weapons in the house? Is there any violence going on? If there is anything that indicates any sort of unrest, physical unrest, right, or threat to harm, those clinicians will not go out, because they do go out to those homes, right? Those clinicians will not go out without police being called. When a call comes into the police department, it would be difficult for dispatch to be able to make that same assessment with the number of calls that are coming in. So it's best that whatever call comes in, you go with a police officer to make sure that it's safe when you arrive. So I stand back. Police officers do the initial door knock. They walk into the scene first to make, and just their mere presence can be very calming in a situation. In some situations, it can be escalating, but they are aware of how to handle those situations. A lot of times, especially one of the officers from this unit, Sergeant Costa or Officer Shears, they'll say, look, we're just here to help. We have a clinician here. No reason for you to get upset. They'll keep their tone low. They'll keep their cadence slow in their conversation. They will use appropriate body language so as not to be intimidating. You know, they're not walking in with their hand on their weapon. They're not looming over somebody. They know how to react in that regard. And then once that is done, I get introduced. So if there are many communities in Massachusetts. We don't run it this way in my 6 communities because of the sheer number that I work with. I work with 6. If I was in Beverly, if I was just in Beverly, which, we're working on getting that done. We might be able to get where there's just one clinician working 5 days a week in Beverly. I would literally be sitting in a cruiser all day long, responding to calls with an officer, and triaging things out in the community. That in itself is such a huge cost benefit to the state. If there was a clinician sitting in every cruiser, it's about $4,500 every time a person gets in an ambulance and goes to the emergency room. Every time a person gets caught up into the criminal justice system, it's about $2,300 kick to the state. So, I've had people with disorders that have gone weekly, twice a week to the hospital because they're unstable in the community, or they're looking for attention and it's part of their mental health issue, which I've added some of those numbers up to be about $45,000 in a month that people, use services. So having a social worker in a cruiser going out there is going to be a cost benefit, and it's also going to help officers handle mental health calls more thoroughly. Their hands are tied when they get out there. They have to address it pretty quickly. And they're a patrol officer, so they're going to be called to another call. So hope that answered that question.
Well, you raised some other interesting considerations that aside from safety, there is, as you point out, an economic consideration of what's the most cost-effective way to handle a problem. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that once you get somebody into the system, the costs just keep running up. You can hear the bells going ding, ding, ding all the time. Mm-hmm. So that raises another issue that I think I hadn't considered, and I don't know has ever been talked about very much, of there's a more economic way to do this. And the other question, I guess, comes down to is there really that much activity in Beverly that would justify a full?
Oh, yeah. 100%.
How many cases do you handle in Beverly in, say, a week?
What I handle and what comes in are different numbers. So like I said, about, 60% of police officers' calls are mental health and behavioral health or substance use involved. So I don't handle 60% of those calls. I just can't physically do it. Mm-hmm. So the officers and I will go through the reports each week and try to siphon through which ones would warrant a follow-up. Mm-hmm. I wanted to respond, George, to you had made a mention about defunding the police. I hear that and it just makes me cringe because, I work alongside these officers, and yeah, you know what? There are people out there who are not so savvy at doing this kind of work. And what police officers have to deal with today is very different than what police officers had to deal with even 20 years ago out in the community. So I work alongside these officers, and defunding is not the way to fix what needs to be fixed. It's actually applying more funds, which you could actually make a cost-benefit analysis where it would be more cost-effective to apply more money towards this than to take money away or reappropriate money that's already being put into a budget. All these officers need to be CIT trained, every single officer throughout the Commonwealth. And that's that community intervention training I talked about, 40 hours. Yeah. That should be happening. And there should be some sort of social work consult in some capacity throughout the Commonwealth. But for Beverly, the size of the community and the demographic of the community and what we see for calls, it warrants a social worker at least full-time dedicated to just Beverly. as does Gloucester, which is one of my communities.
Yeah.
They could use somebody there. It's a very different demographic up there. The program would run very differently than it runs here. Not very differently, but somewhat differently. And then my smaller communities, you know, you would be surprised how much mental health and substance use issues come out of communities like Ipswich or Rockport, you know, small little bedroom communities, you know.
Yeah. Well, that was part of the discussion we had with Cindy about domestic violence and how much is really there compared to what makes the paper and what you hear about. So
Right.
well,
The work that Cindy does is wonderful. She's very, very good at what she does, and we collaborate more and more now together.
Yeah.
Because what goes hand in hand with domestic violence is mental health, and you'll find a great deal of the offenders in a domestic violence situation are struggling with mental health and/or substance use.
Yeah.
And so if we can affect a change there, then we're now making everybody safer.
Yeah. Well, as it turns out, we've had a lot of fun for our half hour, and it's about to run out. Any last words of wisdom that you'd like to impart to the community?
I just want them to know that I'm here.
Yeah.
And if they call the police department, you know, I'm a conduit. I am somebody that can help connect them with services. I am a really good listener. I'm really good at keeping things confidential. It's part of my ethical code as a mental health clinician. And I've been doing this kind of work. I started in domestic violence like Cindy back, oh my gosh, a long time ago in the 90s. When Ronald Reagan was around. But anyways.
I remember him.
You remember him, right? So, you know, there's a lot that I can do before things become a crisis. So the public, you know, can reach me through the police department.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And this is kind of a discussion I think we need to talk about a little bit more, because there's more to it than I think too many people are aware of, me included.
Yeah, anytime, George. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching, and tune in. We'll have some more fun things to talk about.